but just that way we've got us recording here. You know, I may have already told you, I didn't get to talk to you at Soda City Comic Con. That's where our paths did not cross. But my husband did. He went downstairs to the vendor floor. We were upstairs. Barrett and Zach, who are on the All About Nothing podcast, were interviewing celebrities, and I was out there working their table. So I didn't get to come down, but my husband picked your book up. Actually, you know what? I'm going to wait, and we're going to talk about this in the recording. Just kidding. The podcast is basically I pick a topic, and then we delve into that topic and research more. It's something that people might be wondering about, but maybe they haven't Googled themselves or looked up themselves or anything like that. So it's an educational, informative type podcast. It's suitable for all ages, unless it's an After Dark episode, in which case those are marked as such. So I'm going to get us started here, kind of where I will start the episode. And you'll have to bear with me because I'm going to read this part. And then we'll start in full earnest with you. Okay?
Okay. Sounds great.
All right. Hi there, my Wonderlings. Welcome to a very special trip down the rabbit hole. This week, we're going to be revisiting a topic we've already taken a dive into, but this time, we get to do it with a friend. So what topic are we wondering about?
I wonder.
I wonder.
I wonder.
I wonder.
I wonder.
I wonder. We are going back down a rabbit hole that is filled with mysterious and fantastic creatures. Cryptozoology. So I have here with me today James Maxey, who is an author of many things, including this book right here called Cryptids, How We Know They Are Real. He's from Hillsborough, North Carolina, and tell us a little bit about yourself, James.
So, as you said, I'm an author. I've lost count of how many books I've written, so close to 20 novels, several collections of my short stories. I have some nonfiction now with the Cryptid book. I've got a writing book. My next book coming out is called 13 Dooms, and it's about the ways 13 different scenarios that humanity might go extinct. So, my business card says James Maxey, a guy who writes stuff. So that's what I do. Like you, I will get some obscure little bit of trivia in my head and just go deep into the rabbit holes, chasing down, the little bits of obscure knowledge that for most people are never going to amount to anything. And yet I can come out of it with, a 500,000 page, a 500,000 word long manuscript because I got interested in whether or not a dragon could grin.
And can a dragon grin?
A dragon probably cannot grin. Reptiles, despite crocodiles being famous for their smiles, do not have the movable lips that they would need to smile.
I can't even tell you how many books probably say the sinister grin. The dragon's sinister grin. Oh, yes. A little heartbroken on that. So we're going to talk about cryptids, and I mean, that's obviously why I have you here today. But you predominantly write fantasy, right?
Yes. Yeah. Fantasy and science fiction. My most popular series, Bitterwood, is actually hard science fiction that reads like fantasy. It's a post-apocalyptic America conquered by genetically engineered dragons. And so, I'm building this big fantasy universe, but underneath it all, there's a lot of biology and evolution and, just a lot of threads of reality. I like to take reality and twist it and distort it and put it through the funhouse mirrors to create plausible worlds that actually kind of make sense.
That's fun. I don't read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi. I read a lot of girl fantasy, a lot of fairy stuff and vampires, and you know what I mean.
Like Fourth Wing, or do you?
Court of Roses and Thorns.
Okay, all right, yeah.
So the 13 Dooms that you were talking about, is that based on genuine possibilities, or is that a work of fiction also?
No, that is genuine possibilities. I'm not going to list off all 13, but I look at some of the hot ones like climate change, no pun intended, plague, nuclear war. There's the more speculative ones like, alien invasions. We're on the cusp of AI, creating a scenario that AI could, some people think that AI could wipe us out, in the blink of an eye. And, so I look at, some of these fears, and I'm kind of examining, can this actually cleanse the planet of every last human? Because we're pretty resilient. We've been through a lot, and yet, there are some things like the Doomsday Comet that we might not currently be able to endure. Since Bitterwood is a post-apocalyptic landscape, I've been fascinated with the apocalypse really, all my life, long before I was a writer. I grew up in this very fundamentalist church that was preparing for the second coming and the end of the world at any moment. And so, for the earliest years of my life, it was a weekly lesson that, the world is, we're in the end times and the world's coming to an end. So I come by my fascination with the apocalypse quite naturally.
I believe, and it's an interesting topic. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's just when you mentioned it, I was like, I'd love to hear more about that. So I'll have to keep an eye out for it.
Okay.
But
I'll
today,
let you know. Yes, it'll be out on Halloween.
Soon.
Yes.
Okay. Today we're going to talk about cryptids, though.
Yes.
So you've got this book here, Cryptids, How We Know They're Real. And the tagline, when you stare into the shadows, do the shadows stare back? I love that, by the way.
Well,
So what made you write a book about cryptids?
So in addition to growing up in a fundamentalist church, I grew up in a household where my mom worked at Rose's, which was a chain department store. There's still a few lingering here and there around the South.
We have one here.
But back then, there were still racks of paperback books in these stores. And when paperback books get returned, if they've sat there for 6 months and haven't sold, they don't return the book. They rip off the cover and mail that back, and they get a credit, and then they just discard the book. And so instead of discarding these books, Mom would bring them home to me. And the early 70s was like this golden era of alien astronauts. Eric von Däniken, had put out like 6 books, and I got like all of them in coverless format, with these cheap paperbacks. There were a lot of Bigfoot. Nessie was hot. So UFOs, the Bermuda Triangle. So I really, my mom had no idea that while they were trying to teach me about the biblical teaching, what I was really absorbing was this fad pop science, the fringes of reality. And a lot of my love of science can be traced back to these more esoteric invasions invasion's not the right word, but the more esoteric explorations into science that led me into studying deeper the real science behind some of this stuff.
That's really interesting. So we are going to, our first question actually is from Barrett. And since he's here, I'm just going to let him ask it over the mic, and it'll kind of transition us into discussing some of the book more specifically.
Yes.
Barrett, what question did you have for James?
My question actually, and I have to pull it up because it wasn't directly from memory. 1 second, I apologize. Amii can edit this out.
I can't edit this out.
Okay. So, James, my question is, how do you balance the scientific skepticism with open-mindedness when investigating phenomena that lacks mainstream scientific evidence like Bigfoot or Mothman?
Well, so X-Files has the famous slogan, I want to believe. So I go into this, definitely, wanting to find something there. So if I'm investigating or reading about, a recent sighting of a stellar sea cow, an animal that's supposed to be extinct, and lately there have been, supposed sightings of it. I'm kind of, excited by the possibility that, this could be real. But, at the same time, the key aspect of science is that it can be shown. You can show your work, you can reproduce it. It's not just testimony, it's the fact that, I saw this and I can show you how you can see this. And so just because I want to believe in the Yeti or in the Loch Ness Monster, isn't a reason that I shouldn't approach it and want the same evidence for them that I have for believing in a giraffe.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Do you use any specific methods to, I guess, separate the myths from the potential realities?
So it really just comes down to, is there physical evidence? The biggest, in my book, I try to build plausible scientific scenarios for most of the cryptids. So like for the Sasquatch, I can imagine a very plausible scenario. We know that Asia, as recently as 20,000 years ago, there were other human-like species living in Asia alongside mankind. And humans crossed over the land bridge, so you can imagine some of these other species also making the journey. You can also imagine these species learning to be very afraid of people. So evolutionary pressure could make them, very aware of us in ways that we would not be as equally aware of them. I guarantee you, if you're out hiking in the woods, you could have, a raccoon within, 100 feet of you that you don't know is there, but that raccoon knows that you're there.
Sure.
And so these Bigfoots could be, wary of us. They could have evolved to have the better scent, than a bloodhound, and know to catch us on the wind, and they're out of the way. They have good hearings. So I can imagine, from what I know about the biological history, geology, evolution, I can imagine ways that you can build a plausible Bigfoot. And yet, at the heart of it all, I can make my argument, but an argument is not evidence. I need it before I can say, here's why this is plausible, but I can't say this certainly exists until I actually have a body or some other physical evidence that other scientists can come and look at and count as real. It's going to take more than just a video. A video would be very, it could be compelling evidence, but we for something to be established as a species, you need a body.
Sure. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
And that segues into, so in your book, you use a reality meter.
Yes.
Is kind of how you balance that thought, that concept of this is plausible. Now let's talk about whether it could be real. So tell us a little more about the reality meter and what goes into that.
So I rated it on, various criteria. So one of the first things is, does this creature make sense biologically? So for something like the Bigfoot, yes, it makes plenty of sense biologically. The fossil record is full of species that could, we know we aren't the only primate species to ever, exist on the planet. So we do know that, and we also know that primates can live in the Pacific Northwest because we've done it. We're at heart primates, so there's no reason a close cousin of ours couldn't also find the terrain hospitable. So using evidence like this to look at whether or not it's plausible, I don't really consider, though, eyewitness testimony is enough to get you put on death row in a court of law, but eyewitness testimony is unfortunately not sufficient to establish a scientific reality. And it doesn't matter how trusted or respectable the witness is, if they can't reproduce it and show it to you. If you go and you can't see it for yourself, then the default position still has to be, all right, it's not yet proven. And I can go off on a tangent here, but have you heard about the planet Vulcan? Not the Star Trek Vulcan.
I was going to say from Star Trek.
Yeah. So before Einstein, back in the late 1800s, the astronomy started getting really good, and one of the things that they found out was that the orbit of Mars didn't quite match, or not Mars, Mercury didn't quite match up to the expected orbit. And so a lot of scientists were like, oh, you know what would make the orbit make sense? If there's one more planet between Mercury and the sun. And the math was very supportive of this planet existing. And so it was called Vulcan. And there were a lot of scientists, very noteworthy, respectable scientists, who said, we saw the planet, in transit across the face of the sun. But no one could ever quite work out the math to say, well, here's the date it's going to appear again. If you point your telescopes at the sun on this day and the conditions are just right, you're going to see it. And so every time they were making predictions, people would go on these massive expeditions, set up telescopes on the tops of the tallest mountains, aim their telescope at the sun on the right day, and of course it would rain. There are so many reasons that they couldn't see the transit. And yet, eventually they were like, none of this is working out. And then Einstein came along and explained how the sun warps space around it and creates this kind of different gravity equation than we had under Newton. And you plug in with Einstein's equations, and suddenly the Mercury makes sense. And there never was a need for this planet. So for me, if respected scientists, the top astronomers of the day, can assure you that there is a planet, that it all makes sense, until they actually prove that planet is there, you have to retain that skepticism. So that's, I know I feel like I've gone off on a tangent and hijacked it, but that's, scientists have to obey their own rules. If you want cryptozoology to be seen as a serious offshoot of zoology, and you're actually hunting for hidden animals, then you need to follow the same rules that a typical zoologist would prove to go out and learn the habits of a puma or an ape.
And for several of the cryptids in your book, one of those things boils down to poop, right?
Yes. So, if there's a Sasquatch, one of the TV shows I watch is this show called Alone that's on the History Channel, and they take survivalists out and they drop them off alone in the wilderness. And one of the first things that happens every season is they're wandering around in the land that they're going to be living on, and they find bear tracks, and then they find bear poop. And only like one time in 10 after finding the tracks and the poop do they actually see a bear. But it's very easy to identify, the difference between bear poop and moose poop and beaver poop and, just all these other types of scat. If there's a 600-pound gorilla living out in the Pacific Northwest, it's going to be producing 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of poop every year. And if you're finding its footprints as often as people claim they're finding footprints, you should also be finding these
Piles.
Mystery poops. Now, admittedly, poop breaks down quickly in the environment, but some people are finding footprints that look like they were made 10, 15 minutes earlier. And so the lack of, and you also, even if it's like covering its poop or something, you couldn't hide it from a dog. It seems like you could just take a dog out and find this mystery poop, and you would very quickly be able to determine it's not a human diet. It's not a bear diet. If the Bigfoot is out there, it's going to have its own unique diet. And even though we wouldn't know what the genetic signature of it would be, we could still tell, oh, well, this is not deer, this is not bear, this is definitely an unknown creature, and we've got to track it down. And some of the shows I watch, Monster Quest and other stuff, every now and then you'll find them like, oh, we're going to collect this, poop, and it's, it's always inconclusive. But by now, I think that we have enough that we could make some conclusions.
I would think so. So we've talked now just a little bit about Bigfoot. And in your book, you and I actually discussed, so the original episode that I did on cryptids, you talk about every single one that I talked about,
Okay.
Except for I also talked about Jersey Devil, which might be a little more folklore, but we'll talk about that a little later.
I actually, if I were rewriting the book today, I would have included the Jersey Devil.
Oh, yeah?
I thought it was just pure folklore and there was nothing there. And then, everybody who comes up to me and is like, well, what about the Jersey Devil? And more of them are making the case that it's a flying fox, that it's an African bat that came over on a colonial era, and that if you look at these flying foxes and compare them to the early depictions of the Jersey Devil, that they have very similar horse faces. They've got, the wings are there. There's some colonial era illustrations of the Jersey Devil that match up pretty closely. And so now I'm like, I think I dismissed it too quickly. I don't think there's still a Jersey Devil, but I think there may have been a real animal behind it.
Well, that actually, I'm going to go ahead and play a question now from Dylan about fantasy and folklore versus cryptozoology for you. Okay.
What marks the difference between fantasy and folklore and cryptozoology?
So between fantasy, folklore, and plausible, whether or not you think it's a real creature. So I think there are fantasy creatures that, are just purely fictional, that an author created, the beholder, D&D, you have a beholder, you have plenty of animals and creatures that are created, specifically for that game or created in a fantasy novel, and no one is seriously taking those. Then you have the folklore, so you do have things like the unicorn, where for a long time people believed in the unicorn. They were putting it on their coats of arms, so it didn't seem like that implausible of a creature. It started getting some mythology added to it, but for the most part it's a horned animal with just one horn, and animals with two horns were common. Why not have just one with one horn? So it wasn't necessarily this huge ask to push to that. So that would be more folklore. And then there's things like the Sasquatch or the Yeti, where people aren't claiming, oh, this is people are treating it as, okay, this is a real animal. It has no supernatural properties. We think that there's enough circumstantial evidence and enough there for us to go out and mount expeditions and do our best to track it down and actually determine whether or not this is a real creature. Or I don't know that you could ever determine that it's not a real creature, but at least you can hope to be the one that finally delivers the final proof that everybody respects.
Right. So, and I think that and it's been a while, like I said, Cryptids was one of my first episodes. So it's been a little while since I did the research on it, but there are standard creatures who are commonly accepted as cryptids. And the fact that totally independently, you wrote a book and you included who you've included, and I wrote a podcast, and with the exception of the Jersey Devil, every single one I talked about is also in your book. And then your book has a little more in it too. But then when you think about it, so Jersey Devil, and you've given some really fun information on that. But like Lizard Man, I'm from South Carolina,
Right.
so obviously I also included Lizard Man in my episode before. But it reads a lot like an urban legend. But generally speaking, people accept it as a cryptid.
Yes. So it fits in the, I don't know what the, it's enough of a cryptid that cable television networks can send their hosts to South Carolina to ride around on ATVs, country roads, and get out on bass boats and or kayaks and go into swamps. So there's enough there that you can fill up an hour of TV looking for it. I've been to Bishopville. I don't think they do the Lizard Man stomp anymore. I think that might have died with COVID. I would love it if they would start it up again. I'd go sell my book there, but
For sure.
I think there's even if I don't think that there's a lot of people there believing in it, it's still fun to have this, this mythology and local legends. It's a bit like you don't have to believe in ghosts to have a haunted house in your town that you're like, oh, that's supposed to be haunted. And you might not believe in the ghost, but the story has attached itself to the house. And there's value in stories, whether or not you believe that they are actually reciting provable, verifiable fact. You still can have lessons or emotional resonance, or just some sense of justice that might attach itself to a ghost story. And I don't know that that any of these higher meanings have ever applied to the Lizard Man, but it's a lot of fun. Go kayaking in South Carolina. I have come up alongside, alligators, the length of my kayak. So I know that you can plausibly feed a very big reptile in the swamps of North Carolina, or swamps of South Carolina. Biggest flaws are there's nothing in the fossil record that hints at these humanoid reptiles and its habitat. One of the things I talk again and again in the book, does the habitat, could you actually conceal something? And if you're from California or New York City and you hear, some podunk town called Bishopville, South Carolina, you're imagining it's the middle of nowhere. It's the wilderness. It's empty territory. It's like, no, the swamp where it's seen is directly adjacent to an interstate. You're half hour down the road from the capital of South Carolina. There are
Dollar Generals. Come on.
Yeah. Well, there are thousands of cars, rolling up and down directly adjacent to this sighting zone on the interstate. And if you just look at it on a map, there's not a lot of forest there. People in South Carolina farm the land, and even if there is a forest, there's hunters out there in it. There's really just not that much remote space left in that portion of South Carolina.
Yeah, so the reality meter on Lizard Man, and you score things 0 to 100.
Yeah.
Lizard Man gets a whopping 7.
Yeah, he's pretty weak. The only strong evidence he has is the could the habitat sustain him, and yes, the habitat could. He is plausible that something like that could survive, but without any, without something in the fossil record, some precursor creature that I could say, oh, this is a variant of this creature that lived 20,000 years ago that has survived today, is just hard to come up with a good scenario. And it's one of these things where it's recent enough. It and the chupacabra and Mothman are all kind of recent cryptids, and almost always you can trace back. Here's an initial sighting, and then here's the point where they became famous. The second incident that suddenly brought this local legend to internet or into a national newspaper. And once it breaks out, if you've got a cool name, Lizard Man, Chupacabra, Mothman, then these things can really take on. Good branding is at the heart of a lot of good cryptids.
I'm going to agree with that. You can find Mothman apparel everywhere. Like you can walk into a
Oh my
Hot
God.
Topic today and get yourself a Mothman outfit, or
Yes.
Spirit Halloween, and you can be that for Halloween.
At these shows I do where I go and sell my books, I also have a line of buttons that I do. And a few years ago, before I wrote this book, I started doing cryptid buttons, and I had a Nessie button and a Bigfoot button. And I was like, what's another cryptid I could do? And because so many cryptids are just variants of Sasquatch. The grass man and the skunk ape and the Boggy Creek monster are all basically the same North American big ape. If any of them are found, then we can just check a box and says they North America has its own native species of big ape, and I'll be happy to accept a 4-foot ape with size 4 shoe size as a Bigfoot. I forgot completely where I was going with this.
Your buttons.
Yeah, the buttons. So yes. So I couldn't think of another button. I said, I'll do Mothman, but he seems like he's such a nerdy specific topic. Like I know who Mothman is, but my wife had no clue who Mothman was. And so I thought I'll put it out. And it was like, oh my God, I had no idea that there was such a Mothman fan base. I order these buttons 100 at a time. Mothman, I order, many, many times a year. He's just so much more popular than Bigfoot, Nessie, the jackalope. All these other cryptids, live in his shadow. He's become hot. And I'm uncertain why.
I think that's the supernatural component to that one. So the intrigue of the bridge and all of that people really, you want to believe when things are not coincidental. I think that's got a whole nother level to it.
Maybe, but it seems like that sort of back prophecy where, it seems like every place, like it's hard to believe that, within a 3-month window of the lizard man first being reported in Bishopville, that there wasn't, a wreck on the interstate or, a big murder or something. And, why, there should be always enough of these background tragedies going on. But I suppose the one in West Virginia was, the collapse of that bridge was such a big national tragedy that I guess that's what it needed to get attached to the lore. The other thing that's mysterious about Mothman, though, is when he became a moth. Because initially he was a bird, I'm still at a loss to tell you exactly. I've been to the Mothman Museum, and they don't really, if they answered this on some placard in there, I completely missed it. I don't know how it went from we were chased by a giant bird to there's this extra dimensional moth that appears that phases in between our reality and another's to warn us of impending doom.
It would be nice though. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either, but I definitely, especially with my age group's a little high for it, but with your younger millennials and your elder Gen Zs, Mothman is very, very big.
Yeah, so. It's really, so Mothman, and this is a real creature, but I don't know when the axolotl got hot.
Oh my God, like 2 years ago, right? Like all of a sudden everywhere.
Yeah, it's like if you talk to people over 40, most of them, kind of will draw a blank with the axolotl, but anyone under 20 knows what an axolotl is. It is, I just want to know who his marketing team was because I want to talk to them about some of my books.
I feel like the axolotl is one that if you hadn't seen it, it doesn't really sound believable.
Yeah.
And the platypus, you talk about that one too, but the platypus, not believable.
Right.
But totally real.
Totally real.
On the reality meter, there are 2, if I'm remembering correctly, 2 that rank pretty high.
Yeah.
And one you've already mentioned a little bit when you talked about the jackalope, right?
Yes.
So I didn't talk about the jackalope at all in my previous episode. So if you don't mind, could you give us a little brief rundown of jackalope and why it ranks so high?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a spoiler, but the jackalope, so if you're going through the book and you're wanting to know which ones I think are real, I spend most of the jackalope chapter talking about how that it's kind of absurd, to think that the jackalope is a real creature. We can trace to when, to the very bar and the taxidermist who put together the first Western jackalope that was displayed in the bar. It kind of became a tourist attraction. Its origins are fairly well known, and yet you have this well-documented mythology of how it was created and marketed as a fictional creature, or as a joke, and yet there's like natural history and drawings in Germany from from close to 500 years ago, where they're drawing pictures of horned rabbits. So this is before the hype, and then there's just a few other bits, and then just started seeing the pictures, and it turns out that rabbits can totally grow horns. They can get affected with the Shope pimplum virus, I believe it's called, and when they get wounded, uh, uh, the virus will cause the wound to start producing keratin, the same stuff your fingernail is and they grow these gnarly, gross horns. And they frequently are being bit on the face, so these horns are frequently coming out of their jaws, etc. And I'm sure you don't see them in the wild much at all, because if you're a rabbit, you're needing to get through tight spaces and brush and be fast. And if you have a 3-inch horn growing out of your jaw, that's probably going to hinder your survival. But in zoos, these things can survive, and so once I was like, oh well, here's if rabbits can grow horns, the possibility that someone somewhere in the wild, someone has encountered a rabbit that has 2 of these horns growing out of its forehead is certainly not an impossible scenario. So I tend to apply very broad categories to my cryptids. I mentioned, I would accept a short, tiny, small-footed Bigfoot. I would accept a Nessie that, is no larger than a largemouth bass. But yeah, so it might not grow the magnificent antler racks that you would like them to have. But horned rabbits are totally a thing.
And they're in zoos.
Yeah. So just because people have lied about it and hoaxed about it doesn't mean that it's not real.
So then the other one, which felt like it was potentially a sailor's story. I mean, it's in every Love Pirates. It's in every pirate anything you've ever dealt with. So the other animal that got a very high reality score from you, or the other cryptid, was the Kraken.
The Kraken, yeah. So again, I'm applying a fairly broad definition, but the Kraken was kind of interesting. So it is supposed to be just a very large octopus or squid, and it's supposed to attack ships. And tentacles would be found washed up on beaches that would be enormous, and you would measure them and you'd think, well, this must be coming from a creature 60 feet long. You would also, whalers would find sucker wounds on the hides of sperm whales, which eat squid, and scientists could work back and think, wow, this must be a giant squid that's down there that they're preying on, and yet no one had ever seen one. No one had ever photographed one. No one ever had collected an entire body. So it's almost the opposite of every other cryptid, where we would have blurry photos and eyewitness accounts, but no body parts. And here we had body parts, but 0 eyewitness accounts that were, worth anything, no photographs. And that just changed just in very recent years. They finally have a couple of films of these colossal squids, and none of them are yet the biggest possible specimens. They've got some, I think the ones they filmed are topping out around 40 feet, but it's still really exciting to know that you could have a creature this large that, with all of our modern tools of observation, we took centuries to track it down and be able to say, yes, this is an actual creature, and finally collect, the body of one to meet the scientific standard for reality. So, you can argue about, whether this deep sea creature is the giant monster that was attacking ships, or said to be attacking ships. But again, with the broad brush, I'm perfectly satisfied if it's a living, real animal that's still swimming in our oceans with 60 foot long, and that it could possibly, there could possibly even be bigger ones out there. I consider the Kraken pretty much spot on, proven.
Yeah, like I didn't consider that when I was researching before, but that chapter makes perfect sense to frame it up as a giant squid, a colossal squid, and the depths of the ocean are just so immense, and there's just so much of that we haven't seen or gotten to.
Yeah, the idea that, sailors could have actually encountered these creatures, and some of the stuff is tall tales, but over the years, all it would take would be a few sightings to grow into a legend. And so, I like it when there's actually something behind the legend. So yeah, it is. I call it my reality champ. And then it's the sad part of cryptozoology is, once you actually prove a cryptid is real, it's no longer part of cryptozoology. It's just part of plain old zoology.
Yeah.
So the Kraken is now, the mythological component of it, and the colossal squid is the real world component of it. And it will slowly, leave the realm of cryptozoology and just become accepted, science, the way that the Apoki, the kind of antelope, or not antelope, similar to the zebra, forest zebra, was a cryptid at one point, and now it's just, you go, they're established as being real, and no one really, they're kind of a success story for cryptozoology, but no one calls them a cryptid anymore.
Which I think segues nicely into Jenny's question. So I'm going to play that for you. And it's kind of the opposite of what you just talked about.
At what point do scientists deem an animal a cryptid and unworthy of additional serious scientific research?
So I don't think most scientists would just automatically, out of hand, say that's unworthy of serious scientific research. I think that there are scientists who would be very interested in seeing, evidence for a Sasquatch or for a Loch Ness monster. But at the same time, the world is vast. There's a lot of stuff to study, and you can devote your whole life to chasing something that might not be there, or you could choose to specialize in something that you absolutely know is there. And so, if you want to advance in science, if you want to become, an expert in zoology and have people view you as a respected authority, you're better off deciding you're going to study a puma, even though pumas are very elusive, they're difficult to track down. But if you go out and you set the camera traps and you search the right areas, you're eventually going to even if you don't come face to face with a puma, you're going to gather the evidence and learn stuff about the puma. Someone deciding to pursue the same path with the Sasquatch, it's going to find that he doesn't have a whole lot to write about for the journals. He's not going to have the sufficient body of evidence, because the eyewitness of reports, it doesn't matter. Everyone who sees it could be telling the truth. It's still, you just need the bodies, you need the parts.
So I'm going to actually play Cheryl's question, because I think that we just talked about how scientists often will choose to study a puma or something that they can specialize in. But Cheryl's got a question about people who do study cryptozoology.
Is there a preeminent authority on cryptids that you know of? Is there a
Sorry.
Yeah. So that was whenever that is a very interesting question, because whenever I think about, so the grandfathers of cryptozoology, I'm going to say his name wrong, Bernard Heuvelman and Ivan T. Sanderson, were kind of biologists who were taking these things seriously and proposing that there's proposing this new field of study for cryptozoology. And yet they've kind of have fallen into obscurity. If you search them up on Amazon, you don't find their books. Most of their books are out of print, and it's not like they've got thousands of ratings where people are turning to them. I think that of a kind of a researcher that I have a certain respect for, and if he is pursuing it, I'm going to assume that there's something there to pursue. Is a guy, he's called Forrest Galante. He had a show on Animal Planet called Extinct or Alive, and he was going out searching for animals that were said to be extinct, but there had been a few more sightings, and maybe there's something here. And so he had this open-minded approach, but at the heart of it, he's like, well, we can't say this is still out there until we collect a specimen. So there's still the science underlying it. He later did a show called Mysterious Creatures that was looking a little more into speculative stuff. He did a lake monster episode in that. So I really kind of enjoyed his approach, where it felt like his show was using the appeal of the mysterious to explain why a reality is so wondrous. That things that we think of as mundane are actually kind of amazing. So you can use this tease to draw people in. And in a way, my cryptid book, the subtitle is really kind of the theme of the book, how we know they're real. This is, I'm writing about cryptids, but beneath it all, I'm trying to do a lesson about politics and religion and 1,000 other claims that you get confronted with in your daily life. People will say, well, this is real. This is real. And not always do you have evidence. Lots of times you're just having to judge on conflicting narratives, vague evidence that can be interpreted in different ways. You see this all the time in finances. People will see like, well, this number is at this point, and half the people will be like, economists will say, well, this is amazing. This is great news. And other economists will go, what's this actually absolutely the worst possible number this could be at this moment? And kind of learning to think critically and weigh this competing bits of evidence. Cryptids are great for this, to hone your brain on these kind of unproven and potentially unprovable claims. I tell people, we were talking about the puma. If you want to go study a puma, no matter how serious you are, you're never going to, you could go and learn everything there is to know about pumas by reading books, by going to see them in a zoo, and never have a single original thought. You're going to just be received wisdom, things other people have learned. You can learn them without thinking about them. You can gain this knowledge that other people have put the effort into making, and that's kind of how our civilization is built, by getting this received knowledge. It's our great superpowers as a species, but it's not necessarily critical thinking. So cryptids, where it's still on the edge of reality, are a really good place to hone your brain on what types of evidence you should be respecting, how you can build up these great scenarios and great backgrounds in your mind for how this could be plausible, and you can convince yourself, and then you can pull back and say, all right, I've convinced myself, but what is the evidence I need now to convince others? I might have a great argument, but do I have great evidence? And so this book is kind of my way of using cryptids to kind of encourage a sort of examination of how we know what is real.
Well, we have been talking for a minute, but
yeah,
Zach,
I can ramble.
No, you're wonderful. Zach King, who is a co-host on the All About Nothing podcast I mentioned earlier, he is the reason why I did the first cryptozoology episode. He's the one who wanted me to delve into that. And so our final listener question for today comes from Zach. So I'm going to play that for you.
Have there been any recent additions to the cryptid family?
So not particularly. So there's always little sightings of, as far as, in North America, a place that's even vaguely mountainous or vaguely remote out of the way, there's always going to be some new sighting of, a new, land ape for North America. And I kind of, have reached a point where I'm tuning those out. Even though when I travel around the country to the events and I'm selling the books, I'm constantly having people tell me about, did you hear about the Bigfoot they just saw, on the, here or there. So yeah, I would say, for recent entries into it, I've already approached the lizard man is kind of a newbie. The chupacabra is weirdly very new, for it. I mean, he was like explosive, it's like a report of some, drained animals in Puerto Rico, and a DJ, jokingly called it El Chupacabras, for goat sucker. And 2 years later, the chupacabra is like internationally famous.
Yeah.
But as far as the most recent one, I've been vaguely watching. So cryptids can be an unknown animal, or they could be an extinct animal that, is still possibly still out there and still gets the occasional sightings. So recently there have been some claims that the stellar sea cow is still alive. That's kind of a manatee-like creature, and supposedly it's been extinct for, over 150 years. There have been some possibly faked videos that supposedly show what could be stellar sea cows, but I'm I'll keep I'm open-minded about it. I mean, if the oceans are big places, and you can imagine, I mean, with the hunting of sea mammals, you can imagine the ones that survive get very, very wary. The ones that survived would be the most, risk adverse, and the ones most able to, to know to be, go the other way if there's any hint at all of a boat in the area. So, I'm keeping an open mind. I can see scenarios where it could be working, be real, but again, I just, I need, especially today, I can type in, to my browser to, I can type into Google's Gemini, generate me a video of, of a stellar sea cow swimming, at a distance, and, get a video, a few minutes later. So, at this point, I definitely, would just need to see a body. But that's one that's currently on my radar that I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it might turn out to, we still might have a few of them out there.
That's interesting. And you make a good point. So obviously we had the explosion in the 70s and maybe early 80s of some of the cryptids. But now we live in a world where AI and deep fakes and all of that is so easily accessible that, I mean, you can do it on your phone. You don't even require any equipment. There's no skill required. How does it make it more difficult for someone who is potentially into cryptids, into trying to find these additional creatures? Does it make it harder? Does it convolute it? Does it bring more?
Well, it just just proves why the photographs and the occasional short snippets of video were never going to be the conclusive proof that was going to establish the reality of these things anyway. That we always were going to need eventually a living or dead specimen of these things in order to be able to say, yeah, they were real. So, it just, we live in an era where just because you see something with your own eyes or hear it with your own ears, if it's on a screen, you still have to bring that skepticism to bear. It's probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better. We've always been in a world full of people who are trying to hoax us. I talk about the Fiji mermaid in here, and people were sewing monkeys and fish together, over 100 years ago, and selling them to sailors, and they were being displayed, at P.T. Barnum's museum. Whether or not people believed they were real, there was always people in the business of faking evidence, and learning to be skeptical, has been part of growing up for a long time, and hopefully we'll get better and better at it. And it can be a little sad that culturally we're losing our innocence like that, or we do have to doubt everything that we see now as recorded. But in the end, sorting out falsehood from truth, has just been part of the human condition, since time immemorial. So anything that makes us better at it in the end will, hopefully be to our advantage.
Awesome. Well, that is all the questions that my listeners have, and I don't have any subsequent questions.
Okay.
Is there anything that you want to say that we didn't talk about? Any subject that you had been like, oh, I really had hoped to have a chance to discuss this before we close out for today?
No, I feel like I really dived in pretty well. This is the first real discussion of the book where I haven't really gone on at length about the Yeti, who I think is a very, very interesting, has a lot of interesting circumstantial evidence. Most of my cryptids I lump together. So like Nessie and Champ for lake monsters, they can be on different continents, but basically I'm just considering the case for all lake monsters. And so biologically, the Yeti and the Sasquatch should be very similar, but they have very different levels of evidence, supporting evidence for them. And so I treated them differently. The big advantage of the Yeti over the Sasquatch is Asia is a better habitat, and caves in Asia are just, there's lots of bones that can be found of human-like creatures from fairly recent times. 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, which geologically is like yesterday. Whereas you come to North America and it's just vacant. We have bones of ground sloths and the saber-toothed tigers and lots of dire wolves, lots of great animal bones and tar pits and great specimens, and yet just no primates. We're just devoid of any apes. And so that's the biggest difference where I'm more convinced that we might yet still if I were given an unlimited budget and told to go find a cryptid, I would go looking for the Yeti, or before I would go searching for the Sasquatch.
Is the Yeti the one that you would go looking for overall?
I think so. I think the Yeti still has so the difficulty of doing the Yeti is that the places where you're most likely to find them are also the places where it's most difficult for an American to go into. A lot of Asia is controlled by places that don't want TV crews, coming in and poking around. So, Russia is not exactly a great place for American journalists and scientists to go say, hey, we want to come have free access to your remote wilderness areas. And, the Tibet and other mountains that are disputed borderline, between conflicts between Pakistan and India and China. So a lot of places where you'd most want to go look are places where governments are going to say, no, you stick to these zones over here, but you
Geopolitics blocking the search for
Yeah,
cryptids.
yeah. You would need a lot of money to clear away those barriers.
Well, then sell a lot of the book. Guys, again, we've got James Maxey on with us today. He wrote, among many other things, Cryptids, How We Know They're Real. This one we picked up at Soda City Comic Con. You go to a lot of the cons. It's also available on Amazon. I've linked it on Facebook plenty of times, but I will also link it on the website. That's all I have. I really appreciate you coming on today. And listeners, I hope that you have enjoyed this journey. And until next time, be safe, be kind, and stay curious.